I'm going to do something today that I don't do very often, and that is bring a guest back for a second interview. But I really thought you needed to hear directly from Dr. Will Moravits. He has been receiving some national attention lately because of a book that he wrote called The Blue Divide and how that affected his life as a college professor. So, Dr. Moravits, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me again. Appreciate it.
So you wrote a book called The Blue Divide. It's actually recommended reading in every class that I teach to police officers. And you are a former police officer. And you decided to, get smart, get that PhD, go into academia, and talk about the book that you decided to write.
Well, as you remember from our interview last year, I really started to write the book after the summer of 2020 with the Defund the Police movement, talking about the high-profile killings, usually of Black men in class, is something I'd been doing, basically since the beginning of my higher ed teaching career. Kind of give the students an overview of basic use of force training, the law, and why the police are trained the way they are, and why things like, oh well, you can't shoot an unarmed person, is not true. There are circumstances that's a justifiable use of force. And then after that particular summer, I thought, I need to try to get this out to a wider audience and write a book and just give it an attempt to educate the general public, because I kept seeing so much misinformation from the media and misrepresentation. I thought that it's the least I can do for the profession that gave me so much.
And the book is it's fantastic. What it does is it helps fight that false narrative that somehow American law enforcement is the problem. So,
right.
You wrote the book, you're going along with your career as a college professor, and correct me if I'm wrong, as a college professor, you are encouraged to get published.
Correct. Now, my full-time employer was a local community college in the San Antonio area, and I worked adjunct at Texas State University. So being published at the community college level is not the norm. Usually it's something that would be celebrated at any level, but it's not required for my particular position. But yeah, traditionally, like at Texas State, my department, if a professor writes a book, they have a copy of it on display in the office, regardless of the topic, because it is something that brings prestige to the institution.
So here you are teaching, government and topics like that. And there started to be a little concern on campus with the book and your views as it relates to the American law enforcement officer. And again, that false narrative. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So, I was doing, my rounds promoting the book last spring. It was my first spring with this particular institution, St. Philip's College in San Antonio, which, despite the name, it is a public institution now. It did start off as a private, but it's been public for a number of decades. And you were actually my first interview. Most of the interviews I did were fairly friendly to law enforcement, or at least in the middle. But one particular interview I did was with a progressive leftist who is pretty suspicious of police, to say the least. We had a good conversation. He wrote about our conversation in the Daily Kos, and it got the attention of an employee at the college, and they took umbrage with some of the things that I said I taught in class, namely that police are not discriminatory in their use of force, deadly force with Black people. And one particular video that I would often show is the old skit from the 1990s Chris Rock show, which was how not to get your ass beat by the police, which is kind of it's a funny video that kids tend to remember, but there is a lot of legitimate, good information in there. So I had to meet with one of the vice presidents and members of HR to kind of defend myself of why am I teaching this in class? And again, this is a political science class where the textbook talks about Black Lives Matter and actually promotes in the textbook the false narrative that police, killing of Black people is basically that Blacks are misrepresented or disproportionately affected, I should say, which the actual data does not support.
And so you talk about, one of the things you talk about, right, is the actual data when it comes to police use of force and the different, races that we end up using deadly force against. And we'll talk more about that. But I want to talk about that. And I want people to understand what the professor said, that in the textbook used at his college, they promote, and this is Introduction to American Government, they promote the Black Lives Matter movement that we now know, there's Black Lives Matter Global Action Network. It's an organization that admittedly is a Marxist organization, and they have now been caught in basically what is a financial grift. And because of that, they have lost over 80% of their donations. And the data is now showing, since they've been in existence, they really haven't taken, or I should say, they really haven't done much for the African-American communities here in the United States, even though they've taken in millions and millions of dollars. And again, when you're teaching a class, Introduction to American Government, I would suspect that you'd want to talk about Marxism as a bad thing. Am I right?
Well, generally, I mean, that's, Marxism is what led to the communist revolutions in multiple countries in the 20th century, and I think led to the deaths of somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 million people, which is almost 20 times as many people as the Nazis killed in the Jewish community. So yeah, Marxism is generally seen as pretty bad traditionally in American politics. And to kind of jump off your point real quick, in my book, I talk about Breonna Taylor's mom and how she mentions that she could show up to a Louisville Black Lives Matter meeting and no one would know who she was because they didn't do anything to help her. They raised money off her daughter's name, but did nothing to help her. And then the old documentary that Candace Owens did, George Floyd's old roommates and family didn't get anything from him either. And so it's definitely a grift. It's something that it's just shameful, but at least the truth is coming out now.
Well, and you're absolutely right. So there you were, stuck having to talk about that. Fast forward to last year, you were the guest of the National Police Association at CPAC, Texas, where you talked to a lot of people. You had the book there. And I sat next to you for quite a while and heard how you discuss these issues, and you do it with that sense of academic facts.
Right. I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, no, and that is the way that we need to discuss this, isn't it? Very factually, without emotion.
Correct. Because, emotion is something that doesn't do well in intellectual discussions, and so that's one of the things I've always tried to do when talking about this subject. I know it's very sensitive, especially for people who might be affected by it. But the reality is that, in the last 30 to 40 years, policing has dramatically changed in this country. Speaking with members of this book club at the St. Philip's College last spring, that were talking about, back when my grandfather was in Alabama in the 1950s, he got beat by police. Well, yeah, and that was a unfortunate time, to say the least, in American history, but policing has not been that way for a very, very long time in this country. And the data is clear among academics and among those who are willing to look. But the problem is that our media doesn't do that. The statistic that gets thrown around all the time as somehow proof of discrimination is that African Americans make up 13% of the population, but 26% of police killings, which is true, but it is lacking a lot of nuance. It does not take into account the amount of police contact with Blacks versus other particular races, and the amount of crime that is committed by different races, which is, this is documented not just from the FBI and the CDC, but even from the National Crime Victim Survey, which doesn't involve law enforcement, so it can't be tainted by any kind of bias. And what we know is that when you factor in that account, whites are actually slightly more likely to be killed by police in the similar circumstances. But if you were to look at the media, it's almost like they think that they kind of portray this idea that only Black people get killed and no one else. And that's obviously not true.
Well, yeah. And just so folks know, the statistics, we American law enforcement, we end up having to kill about 1,000 people a year. Last year it was 1,147. And of those statistics, we usually end up killing about 200 African Americans. And so but yet people know, and we've done polling on this, that people believe what they hear in the media and what they are told by activists, that there is somehow this war on African American men by the American law enforcement officer. Additionally, the killing of an unarmed African American man by American law enforcement is a rarity. And when you look at year to year, those statistics, what we would call, and what the FBI, for example, would call an unarmed person is very often someone with a car trying to kill a police officer, someone who is trying to disarm or has disarmed that police officer. And as you know, Will, every year there are, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 police officers killed each year by hands, fists, and feet. So an unarmed person can kill a law enforcement officer or an innocent third person. So again, one of the things that you talk about in the book, and I know one of the things you talk about in class, is those nuances, that it's not just this, forgive me, black and white issue of, here's who the police kill, who they are. And again, you were a police officer, and, not one morning did you or I, when I was a police officer, wake up and say, gosh, I hope I get to kill somebody today. That's not how we do things. And most of us never have to kill somebody in the line of duty. Most of us are never in that deadly force situation in our entire career. So in the career of a police officer, it's a real rarity, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I did draw my weapon a few times, never had to fire. Talking to the officers I worked with, I think maybe 2 or 3 out of the 100 or so officers that, combined probably had over 1,000 years or so of experience. I think only 2 or 3 ever actually had to fire their weapon, because it is exceedingly rare to have to do that. And when it does, it happens to somebody that was on a different shift than I was, but I knew it's very emotionally stressful and can be very difficult to deal with. A buddy of mine with San Antonio police had a justified shooting and the person died. And I remember he told me for almost a month, every time he closed his eyes, he could see it and he couldn't sleep. And that was, doing their job, but we're human and we have feelings. And this is something the media, treats us as we're like some kind of robot that we're never supposed to make a mistake and never have to feel emotion. And that's just not the case at all.
Absolutely. So you've been getting some national attention here, not just because of the awesome book, but because you're spending a little more time at home than usual. To talk about that.
Yeah. So in addition to, the complaint that I had last year from an employee, there was some rumblings at the college because I put some pictures of you and me on Facebook from CPAC, and a picture with me with Steve Williford, the Sutherland Springs hero. And somebody at the college I worked with, who I thought was a friend of mine, started saying that I was associating with an anti-democratic group that was a threat to democracy, that was a racist organization, speaking of CPAC. Over the course of this past year, I guess some sort of a target was on my back. And back in February, a student made some complaints about me that ultimately led to my dismissal from the college, despite the fact that about half the rest of the class testified that what she was claiming was false. But the truth didn't really seem to matter to the college, presumably from everybody that I've talked to. It was just an excuse to get rid of me, dating back because of my views, my time as a cop in this book. One of the complaints, a couple of complaints that the student made had nothing to do with policing, but one, when we were talking about the Tyree Nichols case and George Floyd as well, talking about, how those types of incidences affect the legitimacy of state power, which is obviously something you talk about in a political science class. She made the claim that I was advocating that we needed police brutality. And for those people that know me or have read my book, that's like the last thing in the world I would ever make a claim for. And I have people of, different races and political backgrounds that have testified or written an affidavit that was not true. But the college, I guess, presumably saw this as another excuse to get rid of a conservative white male who was fighting back against the narrative that they promote at that college through their anti-racism book club and their DI programs and the speakers that they get for convocation, which all promoted, this worldview that America is a systemically racist country that picks on Black people. And I just don't buy into that.
Do you think that this is what's happening to you right now is part of this overall war on cops, this overall bad attitude, if you will, toward the American law enforcement officer?
I do. I think, the people that were on my hiring committee knew that I was a cop. It was there in my application. But I think the book and specifically what I teach being brought to the attention of the college, my participation in a few of the anti-racism book clubs, which was basically just an hour to bash police in America, and me speaking up in that book club, trying to defend the police and show them what the real statistics are, at least, like I said, in the last 40 years. I think, it was just a situation where they were like, this is not somebody we want here, and I think had this complaint been made in February and I had never written the book, never attended CPAC, I probably would have not been let go or fired, or however you want to phrase it. It was officially a non-renewal, but my evaluations were all excellent, and the allegations were false to begin with. I think I would still be employed there. But for me, I take it as a situation where they just look at it as this is just somebody who's going to be a fly in the ointment of the narrative we want to push. And so we're just going to get rid of him as soon as we can.
Well, and you're not the first person this has happened to. I interviewed Liz Collin, was a CBS reporter in Minneapolis. She also wrote an excellent book, and her husband, Lieutenant Bob Kroll, was the head of the union for the Minneapolis Police Department, and she got basically sat down in an office, taken off her anchor job simply because she was married to a police officer. Mm-hmm. And they got doxxed, and he got frankly abused at work simply because of his position and his politics. So this happens more often, I think, than people realize. Now, just so everybody knows, Dr. Moravits has an attorney, and he is working through our system, our justice system that he and I both believe in, and he will keep you updated. We'll give you his social media information. But, I want to talk about in these last couple of minutes about fighting that false narrative, this false narrative that you have now lost your job because of trying to fight it, that somehow the American law enforcement officer is the problem. And right now we are in an atmosphere where we have 40% more police officers shot in this country than we did in 2020. We've had over 170 police officers shot already this year. It's a very dangerous time for our profession, Will. And part of that is because of this false narrative. If people keep hearing that somehow we're the bad guys and we're the ones who are going to attack you, then I think there's an element of the population that feels like they have to attack us first. Talk about fighting the false narrative.
Well, you're right. I mean, one of the things that was said in this book club was that, a faculty member made the claim that they would be nervous to call police for help because they'd be afraid that they would be the ones to get hurt. And I'm just amazed. And we have approximately 385 million police contacts between police and the public each year. And we said about 1,100 of them last year ended in a fatality. You do the math on that, it's astronomically low that you would be hurt by a police officer, especially if you are complying and not causing escalation. But it's you got to fight back on the narrative with data, because you're not going to get that from the media. And just a couple little excerpts from the book. There was a study done by the youngest ever tenured professor at Harvard University, a Black man named Roland Fryer, looking at Houston, Texas, right? The data shows that Black people are actually 23.8% less likely to be shot at by police than were white people, right? And that's just in Houston, Texas.
Will, where can people find the book, and then where can they find you if they want to hear more?
The easiest place is going to Amazon. Of course, this is what the book looks like. It's The Blue Divide, Policing and Race in America. You can find me on Twitter at W Moravits23. That's W, M as in Mary, O-R-A, V as in Victor, I-T-S 23. Or you can go to willmoravits.com. You can find my book there, and you can also request me to speak or read my Substack articles. And that's the easiest way to reach out to me.
I tell you, I can't wait to hear how this story ends. I know you're going to keep us posted on Twitter. And thanks again for being with us for the second time. And if you would like more information about the National Police Association, visit us at nationalpolice.org.
Sam, put the gun down! Put the gun down!
Last year, law enforcement officers were involved in hundreds of thousands of use of force incidents. A use of force incident is when an officer must use nonverbal tactics to gain control of a dangerous situation.
Put the knife on the ground.
In many cases, officers have no choice but to use force when a suspect doesn't comply with a lawful order.
Use of force is always ugly. No one likes it, especially police officers.
Together, we can help de-escalate these dangerous encounters. Help police officers by complying with their lawful orders. Don't attack, attempt to disarm, or flee from an officer.
Use of force is an officer's last option. Most incidents can be avoided by not resisting arrest.
If you feel you've been wrongfully detained by a police officer, then seek a legal solution after the encounter has been resolved.
Let's keep everyone safe. Comply now and complain later.